Well, did you celebrate Valentine's Day yesterday? Or is that just not something you guys do something about? We did our celebration a day earlier because Saturdays are not a good day for me to celebrate much of anything because I'm otherwise knee deep in sermon preparation. But cooked dinner for my two favorite girls that live with me. One's my sister, so we want to clarify that. Hey, I remember one time somebody asked me how many people we had living in our household, and I said, well, I got about 4 daughters. I said, they're all from different mothers, but not the woman I married to. And I thought, oh boy, that's going to go up on social media. I'm going to get a call from a district superintendent soon. Well, in today's day, we hear a lot of news, and there's a lot of people who make the news all for the wrong reasons. And so it's often good to remind ourselves that something doesn't work. Oh, there we go. It still doesn't work. Anyway, it's good to remind ourselves that in the past there have been people who made the news for really good reasons, and we probably recognize their faces, and so you may not remember her name necessarily, but you've probably seen her face in the news at different times. Malala Yousafzai. Her story: she was born in Pakistan, and at the age of 11, she began blogging anonymously because it would have been dangerous to do so otherwise. And she was documenting what it was like to live life under the Taliban rule, particularly with the restrictions that there were for girls' education. She became a very prominent spokesperson for an advocate for education for girls. So much that at age 15, she was seen as somebody who was a threat to the Taliban, and she was actually shot in the head while returning home from school. That event made global news, or she was able to be transported to different places, including Great Britain, where she was given the medical attention that she needed to survive and to get past that. Well, in 2014, at the age of 17, she became the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Might recognize this person as well, but maybe if you don't remember her name is Greta Thunberg. She's a Swedish girl. The Swedish climate activist who rose to global fame in about 2018 at the age of 15. After launching a solo school strike outside the Sweden's parliament, inspiring what she called was Fridays for Future movement. She was known for her very uncompromising speeches, such as the one that she gave at the UN that was entitled, "How Dare You?" It's a 15-year-old calling down these political leaders for their lack of concern for the environment. She has mobilized millions of people worldwide on climate action, and more recently became an advocate for human rights in Gaza and Ukraine. But there are many others who we never see in the news. Their faces will never make the news. Their names will not be household names. One such person, I came across her story, and I only know her as Sarah. I wasn't even given a last name, much less a picture, but I saw in one kind of isolated area her story, Sarah at the age of 17 was a high school student in Denver. And she saw on a regular basis, probably a daily basis, the struggles that the homeless people had in her city. And she decided to take action. Instead of merely donating a few items to a local shelter, Sarah took a much more innovative and creative approach to doing something, realizing that one of the biggest challenges that the homeless faced was in getting work and not having the appropriate clothing to even wear to a job interview, much less knowing how to go about that. So she coordinated gathering what she called Dress for Success and she gathered clothing that she could distribute into the shelters to homeless people for that they could dress for success in these interviews. But she went beyond that. She organized mentors to come alongside them to teach them how to actually conduct themselves in that kind of interview. She organized and had her own school community kind of join her in that process. And she's known for having helped literally hundreds of people, many people, change their lives and start a journey to a much better life than that they were on, simply because of what she built into their lives and provided for them. Now, did you take notice? All three of these individuals were young people. Young people who saw a need and decided to make a difference. Part of my story was that I grew up in the 60s. And for you who are distantly, that's so much in the distance, the 60s were a very tumultuous time. It was a time of protest against the Vietnam War. It was a time that was characterized by, tune out, tune in, and turn on. We protested against all kinds of things. We were driven by an idealism that wanted to change the world. This is something that gripped me out from young on. We could see what the main issues were, and we were trying to point them out, although that wasn't necessarily welcomed. That one of the issues was that there was a desire in our Western world to obtain more and more of the comforts of life that were often gained at the expense of those who could barely put a meal on the table. There were wars being fought over control of other lands without a concern for the people who live there, for the well-being of those who live there. Sound familiar? What has changed? Not a whole lot. But, and it saddens me to say this, my generation sold out. Sold out and became the very establishment that we were protesting against. You could say we got bought out by the very thing that we were opposed to. And instead of being part of bringing equality and peace to our world, the boomer generation ended up driving it in the opposite direction. To the point that now many of our national leaders who were part of that generation, products of that generation, are perpetuating the very economic imbalance and the wars that we were protesting against and hoping to change. I say we because in some ways I've never lost my idealism. Some people ask me, why do you wear your hair long? It's to remind myself that I'm a product of the 60s and I have this deep-seated idealism that still is in there. And honestly, I'm kind of a misfit to be a pastor because I still, in case you hadn't noticed, I still harbor some very anti-establishment feelings and sentiments. I've just chosen to be very subversive and to try to rock the boat and change it from the inside out. So that's my calling in life, is to disturb your comfort zone, to disturb the peace, and to get you to question everything that you thought was true and why you believe what you do. But the lyrics of a song by Jackson Browne come to mind. The song's called The Pretender. And then there he talks about these lyrics, referring to the generation that he was a part of as well. He says, I want to know what became of the changes we waited for love to bring. Were they only the fitful dreams of some greater awakening? And later he goes on to talk about what he has become. He says, I'm going to be a happy idiot and struggle for the legal tender, where the ads take aim and lay their claim to the heart and the soul of the spender, and believe in whatever may lie in those things that money can buy, where true love could have been the contender. He closes off the song with this. He says, are you there? Say a prayer for the pretender. There's a lot of pretenders. Say a prayer for the pretender who started out so young and strong, only to surrender. So where are the revolutionary idealists of today? I wonder if they aren't being stifled by the materialism of their parents. where in our best efforts, our desire to see our children have a comfortable life and be productive citizens, we promote safety, stability, security. Honestly, great priorities to have, but the very things that will actually stand in the way of being a close, devoted follower of Jesus. I think we need a new generation of idealists. You know, Jesus' disciples were all young, and I think there was reason by that. They were idealists that were hoping to see their world changed as well, and it eventually was, but not in the way that they had hoped for, or they had expected to be part of. But we need a new generation of idealists who are willing to follow their hearts instead of their heads. Hearts that are broken for that which breaks the heart of God, and are determined to make a difference with their lives instead of living them out in comfortable complacency. The brokenness of this world is all around us. It's there for everybody to see. You just have to watch the news. Gaza has faded from the news, but it's the same. About 85% of the population of Gaza has been displaced. 85%, that's just under 2 million people. That is almost the whole population of Vancouver. When you think about it, think about Vancouver getting bombed out and looking like this, and every person in Vancouver needing to go someplace else with no place to go. They continue to try to live among the ruins that are there. That's their life every day. Children live among those ruins. I don't know what kind of education they get. And the majority of the children, 80% of the children, suffer from PTSD because of the trauma of being confronted on a regular, almost daily basis with atrocities of war. The powers that be have the power to stop what is happening. Friends, I'm going to call this for what it is. It's genocide. It is wrong. It's an injustice that the Western world sits back and talks about, but does very little to do anything about. Cuba's back in the news. I was supposed to go there leave next Sunday for Cuba, and the trips got canceled simply because there's no fuel left in Cuba to refuel planes that land there. So there are no international airlines that can land in Cuba. They get all their oil from Venezuela. And our nation to the south has seen it fit to try to starve out this country by blockading any oil shipments and threatening with tariffs to any country that happens to try to help Cuba out. There are lineups for food every day. Lineups for bread, lineups for the rations, lineups for milk. And you may not get very much at all. Venezuela itself, I grew up in Latin America. Venezuela used to be the envy of other Latin American countries, a place where others wanted to go to work because it was such a productive country. Now it's the country that people are walking miles, kilometers to get to the border of Colombia to escape what is taking place, wading across rivers, and eventually trying to make their way up this way. Well, can I ask you, we don't even have to go very far, actually. I wanted to show you this one too. You just have to take a walk down Hastings to see the homeless down on the downtown east side, where there's little hope to ever leave there. Possibly some of us passed scenes like this even on the way into church today, without maybe taking a lot of notice of the person who's sleeping under the overpass. So what breaks your heart? Does something break your heart? Is your heart so insulated that it isn't broken anymore? Well, we've come to the last sermon in this series. What breaks your heart, Andy Stanley says, is part of a divine design to bring change. I want to come back to that statement. Well, we've come to the end to this last sermon in the series that we've been called Forging a Real World Faith. Forging, because in order for change to take place and for faith to be tested, it needs to be face the fiery furnace of life, regular life, and it needs to be pounded on. And we looked at how we grow a faith that engages the real world, makes a difference out there. A faith that is forged, that will forge in such a way that it will stand up there. It grows through failure. We looked at Peter's failure. And failure is often the road to the growth in our faith. For Peter, it was, Jesus said, when you have come back, when you're restored from your failure, you will fail, he says. When you're restored, you will strengthen your brothers. And he became a power to contend with. We looked at suffering and hardship last Sunday in terms of how that forges in us a real world faith through the life of Paul. So these are tests that come our way that begin to shape our faith into being a faith that can be actually be productive. Those are just failure and hardship and suffering shifts our way from self-dependency to a total dependency on God. You can listen to Peter's conversation, his talk throughout the Gospels before he experiences his failure to what he talks afterwards. And listen to ourselves talk sometimes. And with Peter, the first person pronoun, I won't fail you. I will go to jail with you. I will face death for you. Of course, he did none of the above. When he finished, when he got on the other side and had his restoration with Jesus with that encounter on the beach, he shifted his focus to who God is and his dependence on God. He writes in his gospel, he has given us everything we need for life. And this whole shift takes place. Well, today I want to take a look at how a real world faith is forged through a broken heart. And often what breaks our heart is actually closely connected to those failures and those hardships and sufferings that we've experienced before. Rick Warren says, never waste a hurt. Because that is often the very place that God can use you and work through you to bring comfort to somebody else, to bring encouragement to somebody else. Praise God, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so we can comfort in others in any kind of trouble. Diana and I have learned that by experience through some of the hardships that we've faced, that has opened doors for us to build into the lives of others. But brothers and sisters, you can't hide those things. You need to be transparent. You need to be open about what is taking place in your life and how you're experiencing how it's changing you. Because until you are, you won't benefit from it. Your faith won't grow, but neither will anybody else's. Don't waste a hurt. Don't waste the failure. Let it forge in you a real world faith that builds into the lives of others around you and makes a difference out there. Well, today we're going to be looking at the experience of Nehemiah and what we can learn from him and what he experienced and how he responded to it. Nehemiah was a Jew born in exile after the fall of Jerusalem. The fall took place in 586 BC, and he was born sometime after that. Kind of did the math and looked at it. For those of you who know a little bit of some of the Bible stories, Nehemiah was probably just a little boy when Esther was queen of Persia. Daniel's time precedes his, and he would have not known Daniel, but he probably knew about Daniel. These were tough times in the life of Israel. Tough times as far as the destiny of his people were concerned. Their lives seemed to be in limbo. And some had been able to return earlier under the leadership of Ezra to Jerusalem to try to rebuild the temple, and they had been in the process of doing that. The temple, of course, had been destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar invaded and took them off to Babylon. We don't always fully understand the implications for the Jews for the destruction of the temple. For them, that meant the total abandonment of God to them as a people, as his people. The temple was supposed to represent God's presence within his people. And when his temple gets destroyed and they get carted off, for them, God has left them. God has abandoned them. They've been left onto their own with no hope. That's why in one of the Psalms it says, how can we sing the songs of Zion while we are in a foreign land? See, for them, they needed to be in their own land, worshiping in their temple. Otherwise, there was no other place for worship for them. The partial return of some Jews under the leadership of Ezra and the beginning of the rebuilding of the temple, for them had represented the beginning of perhaps reestablishing them as a people under God, albeit still under foreign rule and domination. But here's the thing. Nehemiah, like many of his other fellow Jews, had adjusted and adjusted to life in Babylon, in Persia. And they were making the best out of a bad situation. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you are like Nehemiah and open to being used in the situation that you find yourself in. And Nehemiah, for somehow, had managed to land actually quite a high position in the court of the king Artaxerxes, that of being cupbearer to the king. This was not just a humble position of serving the wine to the king. The cupbearer had to be a very trusted individual with great integrity, because it was up to him to actually test the wine ahead of time to make sure that it was not poisoned, because there were always the detractors and those enemies of the king who would try different ways to get to him. And because it was such a trusted position, because they spent that kind of time together, often the cupbearer came into a very close relation with the king, and Nehemiah seems to have done that. In fact, the cupbearer at times became like an unofficial advisor to the king, where the king would bounce off him, use him as a sounding board for different decisions that he was faced with along the way. Well, the book we have in the Bible that is called Nehemiah is in many ways his memoirs. In fact, the opening words start out, and he's writing this, he says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, or as one translator put it, this is the story of Nehemiah. And you could add that this is his story that he's telling in his own words. In a sense, he starts out in the middle of his life. He doesn't tell you a whole lot more. It's his memoirs. It's what he wants you to know. It's what he wants to be remembered for. We are left in the dark how he became the cupbearer or anything about his early life. Those questions we are left in the dark about and are left unanswered. But what comes across, at least to me, is that this is what Nehemiah wanted to be remembered for. He wanted this to be his legacy, what he's writing out here. How God had worked through him to undertake the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And so we find him in Susa, which is just off to the side. You can see it, and you can see the great distance it is from Jerusalem. It was about a 3-month travel to Jerusalem from Susa. Susa was the winter capital of Persia, where the kings would go in the wintertime. It was also a location where Esther was appointed to queen. She had her promising acceptance by the king at that time. It's also a place where Daniel received his vision, back that is recorded in Daniel chapter 8. But it's a place where Nehemiah was when his brother Hananiah come back with a bunch of fellow Jews from Jerusalem. They've been back to Jerusalem. And they come back, and he says he wants to find out what has taken place back in the homeland. It's a place where he's never been. Because he was born in Persia. He's born in Babylon. He has not been to the promise, his homeland. But the news is not good. He says, they said to me, those who survive the exile and are back in the province, they are in great trouble and disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down, and its gates have been burnt with fire. The effect of this news on Nehemiah gives us a little bit of an indication what kind of person he was. He says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. He's simply broken-hearted by the news that he's heard about his homeland and his people. For some days, he says, I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah was a person with a sensitive spirit, someone who had a compassionate heart, someone who was empathetic to the plight of others that were less fortunate than himself. He had a cushy job. He had a privileged position. The news leaves him devastated and brokenhearted and feeling deep within himself the need to do something, he knows not what, about the situation in what he has just heard. But he's also a person of tremendous faith and commitment to God. And that in itself is significant that we dare not kind of pass over. Remember, he's a cupbearer to the king. He lives and works in an environment where he is surrounded by pagan practices, religious practices, and all kind of manner of things that would have not been in keeping with his own Jewish traditions. We just have to read some of Daniel to understand what it is for somebody to live in the palace and be in that kind of environment and being pressured to compromise his beliefs. Yet he is held firm to his own loyalty to the one true God. The depth of that relation with God shows not only what is his first response, which is to pray, but it's the very content of his prayer that he prays. It's what he prays for. Notice how he begins praying. He begins praying by acknowledging who it is he's praying to. O Lord, God of heaven. Lord is the word for Yahweh. It's the covenant-keeping God. It was the God that the Jews identified as the one and true God. But the term God of heaven, he's coined a phrase that would have been the Persians' way they referred to God, which is the God of heaven in a very kind of general kind of way. And he's saying, the God I pray to, Jehovah, the God coming, our one true God, he is the God of heaven. He is the only God that exists. Do you stop and think about who you pray to? We're having this conversation in the car on the way here. One of the things, my mind doesn't shut down very quickly at night. So I plug in my headphones and I try to listen to different things. I've taken a listen to somebody by the name of Brian Cox. He's a cosmologist. How do you tell? He's into space and all that kind of stuff. It's fascinating to listen to him. And you begin to realize and understand the vastness of the universe in which we live. The closest galaxy, Andromeda, it's 100,000 light years away. That means the light that we are seeing from Andromeda today started out from that galaxy 100,000 years ago. And that's the closest galaxy to us. Our mind, our human mind, simply cannot comprehend and grasp the vastness of the universe in which we live. Why did I bring that out? Because when you pray to the God of heaven, the Creator God, you're praying to the God who created all of that. And you're saying, He's interested in you. Is that not overwhelming? Is that not a humbling kind of thing? Praise to the God of heaven. He recognized that this God is the God who keeps his covenant with love with those who love him and obey his commands. But then he turns around right away and starts confessing his sins. And he's saying, the God of heaven who made this covenant and keeps his covenant, but we really have not kept the covenant with you, God. And he begins to confess his sins, but he doesn't distance himself from the sins of the people who sinned against God and are the cause why he lives in Persia and doesn't live in Israel at the time. He identifies himself with it. You see, we have a tendency to say, that's them fault. That's their fault over there. You know, the reason our country is so bad is them. We are them. We are a community that hold responsibility. If we aren't doing something to resolve the situations, we are part of the situation. A kind of humorous example is told by Pastor Earl McManus as he's traveling and he lives in LA and he's once again cursing is a little strong, but he's upset at the traffic jam that he's in. And he says he was called up front in a way that he didn't appreciate very much by a big billboard that somebody put up that said, "You are not stuck in traffic. You are the traffic." We together are part of the situation. And when we don't do something about the injustices that are taking place around us, we are part of the problem. Nehemiah recognizes that. And he confesses the sins of his of his ancestors, parents. And he acknowledges that the consequence of their unfaithfulness, that they have been scattered among the nations. But he also prays the promise of God to say, you said that if we come back to you, you will gather us in. And he clearly wants to be part of seeing that happen. Because he prays, then he says that he pleads with God that he would have success in approaching the king to talk about what can happen here and how he can be part of seeing things changed. He fully understands his position before God. He has no right to demand anything. 3 times he refers to himself as God's servant, and 3 other times he refers to himself in connection with the other Israelites as servants of God. It's important to note here that we have simply an excerpt from his prayer, because he says, for some days I mourned and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. And what we read in 1 or 2 minutes here was something that took days and days. He's in this state of brokenheartedness, trying to make sense of what is taking place, trying to hear from God how he can become part of making a difference in the world, that in all this destruction that's going on. It's important to note that because it's not just simply a little 15-minute quiet time that he has at the beginning of the day, nor was it just a single time set aside for prayer. He has his normal duties and responsibilities as cupbearer that he had to keep on carrying on. But as he had time away from those responsibilities, it seems he was engaged in being broken about the situation, being given himself fully to interceding on behalf of his people back in Jerusalem. Not only that, but when we move to the next chapter, and again, you've heard me say this before, we move from chapter to chapter, and it's like we just move on. But there's actually a gap of several months that takes place between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. And we find that there's this time that has taken place where no doubt Nehemiah has continued to be engaged in this aspect of fasting and mourning and praying for his people and for the situation back in Jerusalem. Here's what we can learn from Nehemiah and his experience about it, what it means to forge a real world faith. It starts with being broken. It starts with being broken for that which breaks the heart of God. What we see in Nehemiah is a person who is totally brokenhearted over the situation and the condition of his people back in Jerusalem. That in turn causes him a deep desire to be able to do something about that. But at least at the beginning, he has no idea what that would be like. He's not really quite sure, I don't think, about where that's going to take and what it all will entail. But that brokenness grows out of a close relationship with God as well. At some point, no doubt it dawns on him that there will be a price to be paid here. If he himself is to make his way to Jerusalem, no short journey, as we've already indicated in itself, he will need to be excused from his duties and responsibilities as the cupbearer to the king. Not an easy thing to ask for. Some of you need to ask for vacation time so we can go to Casa Luz. By the way, I need some commitment from you today or in the next week or so. I'll be talking to you and pushing you on that. It doesn't take 3 months to get there. It's a shorter trip than going from Susa to Jerusalem, and it'll be a life-changing trip for you as well. But you'll need to be excused from these. That would risk incurring the displeasure, asking to be released from will risk incurring the displeasure of the king. And kings in those days were very temperamental. To risk their displeasure could be the death sentence for you, no matter what your relationship was before that. So his ongoing prayer is that somehow, in some way, God would work it out so that what he was asking would actually be heard and received and responded to favorably by the king. But this is the other thing we can learn from Nehemiah, is that he has this on his heart, but he's waiting patiently to discern the right time to ask. I used to tell my daughter, because like your children, there's things that she would want to get from me or do. And sometimes she'd come at the wrong time, and I'd say, so Jessica, If you want a positive answer, this is not the time to ask me, because I'll probably say no. You need to discern when is the right time to approach me on these things. You as parents are the same way. Well, he needed to discern the right time to approach the king. And it's easy to get impatient with God's timing. And we try to get ahead of it because we see what we want to see accomplished and we think this is what needs to be done. Well, the opportune moment comes in chapter 2 of Nehemiah, which we didn't read, when the king notices that something has changed in Nehemiah. Something about his countenance reflects this deep sadness that is going on inside, that he's experiencing deep inside. And I think a demonstration of the relationship that the king Artaxerxes has with Nehemiah is he questions what is taking place. He says, you seem so sad. What is wrong here? But even then, Nehemiah is very diplomatic and very careful. He only mentions what has happened back in Jerusalem and how it has affected him. But he refrains from asking for anything until the king asks him, so what is it you want? And I like what Nehemiah says next. He says, then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. Tells me there's this breathes out a prayer as he kind of holds his breath and says, okay, the king has asked me, this is the right time. This is the opportune moment to ask the king, saying, God, would you have him receive this favorably? And he says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. In essence, he's asking to send him back to the land where his people, they had destroyed the city so that they would not be able to rebuild and become strong against. Now note this, because earlier here, as soon as the king asked him the question, Nehemiah says, fear gripped him. Notice this, that faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is not the absence of fear. Nehemiah clearly states that he was fearful. But faith gives us the courage to conquer, to overcome our fear, and act anyway, even in the face of great danger. Developing a real world faith. A faith that's going to work out there. Work outside of the comfortable confines of our home and our church, where this is an easy place to have faith. Developing a real world faith will always call on us to take a risk. That's how we spell faith, isn't it? R-I-S-K. Where there's no risk, there's no need for faith. You got it all figured out. You have it all measured out. You figured this is what you can do. You have the abilities. You got the funds. This is what there's no risk. Where there's no risk, there's no need for faith. If you and I, if we together as a community, as a church, are to develop a real world faith that actually makes a difference outside of these four walls, it will invariably take a risk, taking a risk. Stepping out in faith, trusting God to show up. That doesn't mean everything always turns out okay. It doesn't. It doesn't mean that we won't be spared all kinds of trouble or hardship along the way. It doesn't. However, in Nehemiah's case, he not only receives the permission to leave his post and make the trip, but he's granted the necessary papers that he needs for safe travel. He asks, could you give me these papers so I can make my way safely? And would you, by the way, allow me to go to your lumber yard? A bit of a fix. It's like a place where the trees are growing in Lebanon, and be able to get enough supplies to do the work that is required of me. He asked for the necessary materials needed for the work of rebuilding broken walls. Here's the thing. When we step out in faith, God will not only meet us at that point, and in Nehemiah's case, meets him at that point, and he has a good reception. He goes that much farther. The king not only says, you can go, but here's my credit card. Charge it to me. Nehemiah says, and because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. Nehemiah had this relationship with God to start out with. And it's within that context his heart is broken for what he hears. And it weighs on him. And God is using that him to call him to be part of what he wants to see done. So can I ask you again? What breaks your heart? This week we had the tragedy that we heard about that taking place in Tumble Ridge. And I'm sure that breaks all of our heart to know that. Can't imagine what it's like to be there. Can't imagine what it's like to be a parent who saw their son or daughter leave for school that morning and not come home. I can't imagine what it's like to be the students who are there. And one young girl of 12 or 13 is in the hospital in a induced coma, but without a lot of hope to recover because she was the last one to try to keep a door closed from the shooter coming in. And last point, the shooter broke in and she was the first one shot. What breaks your heart? Do you change the channel on the news? Do you look the other way? It's so easy to do that, isn't it? If our response is that we're just not aware of anything that breaks our hearts, I would say we need to do some soul searching. It would seem that if that's the case, we've possibly insulated ourselves and isolated ourselves from the brokenness in the world around us. Like I said, it's easier to change the channel, look the other way, than to embrace the inner pain that it causes for us to fully grasp and engage in the brokenness that we see. But our calling as followers of Jesus is to follow him into the brokenness of the world around us, to roll our sleeves and get down in the ditch beside the person who's been broken down and lies there. Our calling is to get down there and get down and dirty, to be the source of hope and light in the darkness of the world. And it's only as we begin to forge a real world faith that results in active engagement in the brokenness of this world that we will begin to be part of making a significance for God in today's world. I don't know about you. I'm getting towards the end of my life. I got more behind me than I have back in front of me. And I often think, what is that I would want to be said about me? What do I want to have my life known for? It's never too late, too early to start thinking of that. Because I can tell you from the generation I've lived with, that we get lulled into complacency by the world in which we live. We allow it to squeeze us into its mold policies. I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's great mercy, to present your bodies, that is all of your life, as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual act of worship. And he says, don't conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Don't let the world squeeze you into its way of thinking, but change your perspective. Allow God to change your way of thinking. Be transformed in the renewing of your mind and the way you think. And as we experience that, then we will know what God's good and pleasing will is for us. Not in a big picture only, that too, but on the regular interactions that we have throughout the course of our day. Live that way with a real world faith. Jesus invites us to follow him into a broken world. That's where we will meet him, more than we necessarily will meet him here. I believe he meets us here too, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying, if you really want to experience God at work in your life, you really want to experience the living Jesus at work in your life, That's where you will do in a greater way than here. Question is, will you accept that invitation to follow Jesus into the real world out there that's broken and needs us to come out there to bring light into the darkness and hope into the desperation and the disillusionment that people are experiencing in many ways, even when they seem to have it all together? Will we accept that invitation to step outside of our comfort zone and into the real world around us in a real and engaging way? In his hands, this world is healed. We are the hands of Jesus. That's what we're called to be. I'm always happy to talk further about anything that we've mentioned here, to pray with anybody. We are going to close in prayer. A reminder to those who stay for Adult Sunday School that we'll be meeting today up in A8, because about 11:30 the Mandarin congregation is going to be coming in here to set up for their celebration down here, and we'll need to make way for that, and we're happy to do so. Would you stand with me for the benediction? God of heaven, creator of all that is, you have us in this place for such a time as this because you've called us to follow you, Jesus, into this broken world. We have come into experience your awesome love as our Father. And that has been overwhelming and changing us from the inside out. As we've also experienced your grace and mercy and your forgiveness, Lord Jesus, in our lives. But you also have left us with the power of the Holy Spirit. You've empowered us to represent you in a broken world and to bring healing to broken lives, to bring hope to those who find themselves in desperation, to bring light into the darkness. May we accept your invitation to step out in faith, that we might see you at work in the world around us and in and through us as well. That you may be honored and glorified in our lives, in this church, and in the world in which we live. In Jesus' name I pray.